Okay, everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit about interest groups, finish up talking about that. Then we're going to move on to public opinion. Please make sure you're taking notes as you're going along through this uh, and going over this stuff today because we are going to take our test on Friday over this material. So, interest groups, I believe we left off the other day. We had talked about what interest groups are, how they're different than a political party, and we talked about the very first thing that interest groups do. And the very first thing that interest groups do is lobby. And if you remember, we talked about that. They talk to congressmen. They try to get their ideas across. The second big thing that they do is they electioneer. And by electioneering, what we mean is they aid candidates and support their reelection bids. Uh, they encourage people to vote. They run ads. They donate money. And all those things we call electioneering. That's one of those fancy words that we see in government that you probably won't ever use anywhere else, but you do have to look out for it in multiple choice questions, especially when you're talking about interest groups. One of the four big things that they do is electioneer. They aid candidates and help incumbents get reelected. The third big thing that interest groups do is we call it litigation. Uh, they intervene in the courts. Basically, what they do is they write these things, and here's another fancy government word for you. They write these things called amicus curiae briefs. These are written arguments on a court case. They literally send legal reasonings to the courts to try to sway the decisions that justices will make. It might be federal appeals court judges, it might even be to the Supreme Court. Um, Let me give you an example. Think of the same sex marriage case from a couple of years ago. There were many interest groups that sent amicus curiae briefs to the Supreme Court that were written in support of same sex marriage. There were also interest groups who are against same sex marriage, and they wrote amicus curiae briefs to the Supreme Court justices trying to get them to vote against same-sex marriage. And they're submitted on behalf of the interest groups, and they're written to influence the courts. They're called amicus curiae briefs. It's a word that we'll come back to when we talk about the judicial branch, but they are called friend of the court briefs. The fourth big thing that they do is they go public. They bring awareness to an issue. Uh, they mobilize members into action. For example, this boat down there, the Bob Barker, an interest group spent millions and millions of dollars uh, going after people who were killing whales. It's an anti-whaling group. They bought this huge ship, and it was a big deal. And it was a big deal because A, it cost millions of dollars, and B, they were going after people who were like killing whales. And they named it the Bob Barker after the former host of The Price is Right, because he was real big into animal rights. But going public, so they bring awareness to the issue. So four big things that interest groups do: they litigate, they go public, they electioneer, and they lobby. Four big things that interest groups do. How do they gain power? The biggest way that interest groups gain power is through their numbers. You think about the National Rifle Association, it has over 4 million members. Now, while that doesn't seem like a lot in the whole aspect of our country population wise, but 4 million people is a lot of people to get motivated to do something. 4 million people can change the results in an election. The second big thing that interest groups do is raise money. Election campaign dollars. Um, they raise election campaign dollars to protect their interests. Um, and they give lots of money to congressmen. For example, the Goldman Sachs is a Wall Street firm. They have an interest group. They donated almost $8 million in the 2012 presidential election. Tons and tons of money. Uh, they also provide focus, right? When people care about an issue, it's easier for you to care about an issue and join a group that provides information to what you're talking about and what you believe in. They provide focus to people. The three big ways they gain power. When are interest groups most effective? They're most effective when the issue is not complex, or when the issue is not in the public limelight, and when the issue is complex. Um, For example, like the Affordable Care Act or the Keystone Pipeline. Um, when people don't know about things, that's when interest groups can do the most damage. If it's a complex issue, they work behind the scenes to get things done. Uh, that's when interest groups are most effective. What we're going to switch to next, so we're going to talk a little bit about public opinion. Um, Public opinion is big with interest groups, especially. Um, Public opinion is big with the media. You hear things poll after poll after poll after poll. And when we're talking about public opinion is how people think or feel about an issue. And this is accomplished by polling people, right? And I got the cartoon here. It's the pollster. So how do we measure public opinion? AP government wise, like we don't get super complex for those of you that are in like AP stats, but there are a couple of things that are keys to any public opinion poll. If it's going to be a good poll, issue number one is it's got to be random. You got to have a random sample. That is the key technique in polling people. The larger the sample size, the more accurate it is. It operates on the principle that everyone should have an equal opportunity of being selected for the sample. So large random sample is the key technique of any poll. One other thing to understand when you're talking about polls is there is an error. There's sampling error. That's why where you always see like 95 or 40% of the people plus or minus 2%. When you see that, that's the sampling error. So key features of a poll: number one, random sampling; number two, sampling error. Um, Other things when you think about polls, there are measurement problems. Um, Things like people without phones, right? They're never going to be part of the sample. The way a question is phrased can influence things. And sometimes, and I got it in blue there, but the urge to give socially desirable responses also impacts polling results, which means basically people lie. Um, People lied all throughout the 2016 election. That's why Donald Trump was always down in the polls. And what you saw was people were ashamed to say that they voted for Donald Trump. And when the pollsters asked them about it, they said, "No, we didn't vote for Donald Trump." When in reality, people did vote for Donald Trump. So that's one big problem with polls we see all the time is that people want to give a socially desirable response, so they lie. Um, that's a big problem with polls, which is why you want to always poll lots of people, have that big random sample. Why do we use polls? Polls help politicians figure out what public wants. We have different polls like election day polls, like when you go and vote. Exit polls are used by the media to predict election day winners. Approval polls, issue polls. Approval poll is like just like literally like your approval. Like Donald Trump has about a 38% approval right now. Issue polls, they ask people about issues. Like, what do you think about gun control? What do you think about the status of our country? Is it more favorable or less favorable? That would be an issue poll. Um, and polls are good because they do help people figure out what's going on. The problem with polls is, or the problem with a poll is, a lot of times people lie and that the samples aren't big enough. So we use polls a lot in our world, in the media, with interest groups in government, but it's important to understand two big things. Sometimes the samples aren't always random, sometimes they aren't always large enough, and the other thing, giving socially desirable responses, aka people lie in polls. Um, Couple of things that polls reveal about American politics that Americans don't know much about politics. They know what they believe, but not necessarily about not how those beliefs affect the policies of government. The other thing that we learn from polls is that people don't trust the government. Only about 25% of the people actually trust the government. Um, and the other thing we learn from polls is that we don't like the negativity. We are tired of negativity in government. That is never a good thing. Um, so if you have questions about this stuff, make sure you send me an email. and we will talk with each other on Wednesday. Make sure you prepare for our debate.